Hey, what's up, you guys? This is Paul from Thinking Christian, and today I want to make an interesting parallel between Jesus and the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, who was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, probably one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, unless you're one of those people that does not like Heidegger. Heidegger can be a little bit controversial, even though I think most people appreciate his work and his thought. There are people who think he's sort of anti-philosophy. He's not somebody like Kant. Basically, everyone, I think, loves Kant or Plato and Aristotle. Even if they don't agree with them, they're like, these guys are great. Heidegger, most people think he's great, but there are some people that are just not big fans of him. The other thing people don't like about Heidegger is that he was also a Nazi, which isn't the greatest thing. So if you can get past the fact that he was a Nazi, he does have some interesting things to say. Now, later in his life, he did distance himself from his previous Nazi views. He was kind of when he was younger, he was sort of appointed the philosopher of Hitler, and was in charge of a lot of stuff in Nazism. But he later distanced himself from these views, although he never really totally repudiated them in the way you would hope to find if you're expecting something like him being like, I was wrong for being a Nazi, they were evil, stuff like that. You never see anything like that in his work, at least not from what I've seen. So once again, let's just get that stuff out of the way. I do think his work is still worth engaging, even despite these things. So let's talk about his most influential work, which is Being and Time. Now, Being and Time is written in German, and in the work, he invented a lot of these sort of compound German words that meant certain things that I'm going to try to translate as best I can. I'm not a German speaker, but my dad speaks German, and it's interesting looking at these words, but the main point of this is a word that he talks about called das Sein, which is literally translates to being. And it's the experience of existing or being there, being in the world. And I think one of the things that Heidegger is trying to point out, and basically what he's saying is philosophy has gotten so caught up in the idea of stuff existing and subjects and objects, and it's ignored the fact that we basically just exist in the world. Before we understand anything, we have the experience of existing first. And this existence comes before our knowledge. We have our basically knowledge of our own existence and our experience of the world before we have knowledge of abstract objects or even like fully formed thoughts or even language. We first basically experience comes first. And there's also, he incorporates this with his philosophy of our experience with time itself. That's why the work is called Being in Time. He's basically saying, look, we're always running away from death. We're spending our time running away from non-being or the opposite of being, and we're all afraid of death. Now, one of the parts that's really interesting here is ever since Descartes, philosophy had this idea of a subject-object distinction. So the idea between the Cartesian subject-object distinction is that we are human subjects that have a subjective experience, and we experience a world of objects. And to Heidegger, he thinks that this separation is wrong, is inseparable. We are both an object in the world with our own subjective experience, and so are other people. We just all sort of experience the world. Now, how does this relate to Jesus, or how does this relate to Christianity? Well, when you think of the incarnation of Jesus, what you actually see is a sort of God coming down to the world to have a human experience. Almost the idea that God doesn't just have knowledge of the world as an omniscient observer of us as objects, but he actually took on the experience of what it's like to be a human, and as a result understands. So I'll get to more on that in a moment, but let me give one more example from Heidegger that's worth pointing out. So Heidegger came up with this idea of readiness to hand, and he's talking about a hammer. And basically what he's saying, when you get to hammering something, you get into this state where you're not thinking about the hammer and you're not thinking about the nail individually. You're consciously aware of your experience with the hammer basically being a part of your hand, and you're just hammering. You're just basically you're familiar with hammering as its own thing. That's not just I am moving my hammer to hit nails, even though that is what you are doing. That's not the experience that you're having, or that's not what you're thinking of. What he says is, look, the carpenter doesn't have any conscious recognition of the tools that they're using in these cases. They're just hammering. And of course, the analogy here with Christianity is, well, Jesus was a carpenter, so he had the experience. All jokes aside, I think this is a very interesting thing to think about, because just because we try to analyze objects in a sort of, often in a scientific reductivist sort of way to understand these pieces, is to remember this is not how we usually experience the world. And we've come up with these tools to help us describe or predict the world better. But I do think Heidegger makes a point of the fact that our experience does come first, and it's our experience that leads us to basically prefer scientific type of explanations over maybe more superstitious ones. So why, as Christians, should we care about Heidegger? Well, here's the deal, right? There's a difference between knowledge of something, like a hammer, and knowledge of actually hammering something. There's a good example. It's called Mary's room. It's the idea that you have this person, Mary, not related to Jesus at all. And basically, Mary knows exactly what it's like, knows everything about the color red. But she's colorblind, so she can tell you exactly how the rods and cones in your eye work to produce the color red. She knows basically where the electromagnetic spectrum is according to red. She could answer any question it is. But I still think there would be something we would say is she would be missing something of actually experiencing the color red that can't be experienced unless you actually, I guess, see red. And suppose one day she gets cured of her colorblindness. Would she learn something new? Would she have some new experience from basically experiencing red for the very first time, even though she knew everything analytically about it? Is there something new or different in that particular experience, and something that can't be reduced down directly to just simply understanding all the brain states corresponding to the letter red, these sorts of things? And I think in a similar sort of way, right? The Christian should care about this because we worship a God that isn't just somebody who is looking down at us as objects. This is somebody who, chose on to take a human form and have the human experience, including experiencing death and its associated fears. God had the experience of fear of death and running away from running away from being in the same way that humans were. And I think that's something that it's very, it would be difficult for God to have the experience of fearing death. He could understand the fear of death, but the actual experience of fearing death until something like the incarnation, you can argue, because these are things that are grounded in experience and not necessarily the sort of analytical objective knowledge that we mean when we say God is omniscient. Now, there are going to be Christians out there who are going to disagree with this, and they're going to say God, who is omniscient, understood what it was like to fear death even before this, and that's totally fine. There are other Christians who argue, no, God learned, or God's experience of this, even though it wasn't a sort of objective knowledge, was somehow different, and that's fine too. I'm not going to try to take a side in this particular case, but I do think as Christians we're called to live our lives, not necessarily by just analyzing things in themselves, but by living, experiencing, and engaging with others. And I think this is where Heidegger's point is very well taken in the sense that we see a picture of God and we worship a God who is not just a passive observer in human affairs, and who came down and took on a human form and also intervenes in human affairs. And likewise, as a model to us, we also ought to not just sit back and analyze things, but also live, experience, and engage with other people. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. And I think that the philosophy of Martin Heidegger and the life of Jesus from a Christian perspective are very interesting to reflect upon. So that's what I wanted to do. I'll leave with this verse this is Philippians 2, 6-8, says, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death to a cross. So here we see Paul basically writing about this, not counting equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but something to be experienced, humbled himself by becoming obedient. There's an actual experiential component there. So think about that. I think there's a lot to reflect on, a lot to think about, but just going off the top. I don't really have anything prepared. I was just reflecting on this, and hopefully this is interesting or insightful to think about. So see you in the next video.